Humans spent hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers. Then suddenly, around 8000 BC, we discovered civilization. This anomaly was the subject of an investigation commissioned by NASA, which pointed to a disturbing trend in evolved civilizations suddenly appearing completely developed, and to technology, agriculture, science, mathematics, and astronomy suddenly manifesting in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Yucatan, China, and Peru. Did humans experience a collective inspiration? Or was civilization inherited from someone else? Because around the same time, there emerged stories of unusual people, gods by any other name, appearing out of nowhere, each possessing great skills far and beyond the capability of hunter-gatherers. If so, who were these gods? Were they connected? And more importantly, where did they come from? There are close to 200 accounts from indigenous people around the world describing a global flood 11,000 years ago and how it wiped out most of the human race, as well as a parallel race of unusual people, human-like but not quite like us. It also submerged the island nations where these gods lived, which is why it's been very difficult to locate them up until now. But if you read the stories together and observe the similarities, you get the impression they are more like eyewitness accounts. And two homelands of the gods are very familiar, Atlantis and Lemuria. But have we been so obsessed with these two that we've ignored other equally important locations where a lost civilization of antediluvian gods once dwelt? The first question to ask is, how do land masses just disappear? Historians writing about this topic 2,000 years ago were much closer to events, and they believed the Earth can change dramatically in the blink of an eye. We don't even have to look so far back to find missing lands. Take the case of the St. Vincent Islands, still located on naval charts in 1789, roughly between Baja and Tahiti. A ship's log gives an account of 12 days spent there and how the islands were about 20 miles in circumference, wooded and moderately elevated. The next ship to sail there 30 years later spent 46 days surveying the area, yet found nothing except discolored water to a depth of 720 feet. Then there's the case of Davis Island, 500 miles southwest of South America, a landmass so large it stretched beyond the horizon and was added to naval charts in 1687. Now, 35 years later, a Dutch captain en route to Australia went looking for it, but the island was no longer above sea level. And the captain continued his journey and stumbled upon Easter Island by accident, so his trip wasn't a complete loss. In fact, two other islands existed near Easter Island as late as 1912, but were no longer there 20 years later, despite a failed 3-week search by the US Navy. The point is that Earth is an unstable, unpredictable, evolving planet. And so is the solar system. Expert astronomers like the Chaldeans and the Chinese were under no illusion that the orbits and velocities of planets are absolute, but subject to change and variation, and they forewarn future citizens of the chaos such changes periodically bring upon the Earth, one of them being the obliteration of all traces of former civilizations by meteorites. One event was recorded by the Hopi, the Egyptians and the Tamil of southern India, and it describes a displacement of the poles, a time when the Earth was upside down. And the story appears to take place around 13,000 BC, when a catastrophe generated what is called the oldest dryas, the first of 3 ice ages. And the myths are remarkably consistent with geologic and climatic data. In a similar event in 10,800 BC, the Earth was hit by a fragmented meteor, which led to the third ice age called the Younger Dryas. And ancient cultures claim this event reversed the Earth's rotation. An Egyptian priest explained this to a visiting Greek scholar by the name of Solon, and he said to this man, "There was a change in the rising and the setting of the sun and the other heavenly bodies. And those times they used to set in the quarter where they now rise and used to rise where they now set. At certain periods, the earth revolves in the reverse direction. And of all the changes which take place in the heavens, this reversal is the greatest and the most complete." Solon would take back to Greece another Egyptian account, that of a sunken continent where the gods once lived, which became the foundation for Plato's now famous story of Atlantis. The Younger Dryas cold spell continued for 900 years before Earth was again subjected to a barrage of meteorites around 9700 BC. This event generated a global flood. The tsunami penetrated Asia, breaching the Himalaya and into Tibet. In the Pacific Northwest, tribes experienced waves crossing the Cascades, Olympic and Rocky Mountains. At least 3 tribes described their canoes being dumped on the summit of Mount Jefferson, an elevation of 10,000 feet. Evidence of the flood is in the Great Salt Lake in North America. It is claimed that its saltiness was acquired from mineral salts accumulating from rivers over long periods of time. But there's a problem with this theory. The Great Salt Lake is full of sea salt, and the change in salinity occurred around the same time that the giant waves overran the Rocky Mountains and Central Plains of North America. Survivors were few. Along with world flood myths are descriptions of a pre-flood civilization whose architects were magicians, builders of impressive temples and cities far beyond the capability of cave dwellers. Even they were not spared. Nevertheless, groups of gods appeared after the flood at strategic locations, each accompanied by 7 sages or craftspeople to rebuild the former world of the gods, as ancient Egyptians wrote. Echoes of this civilization are everywhere. In 1966, a row of stone columns with inscriptions was found 55 miles off the coast of Peru, 6,000 feet below the present sea level. Then there are the examples on land, such as megaliths that are out of proportion on tiny Pacific islands. Oddly enough, in the 16th century, the notion that these islands are the remains of a now submerged continent was a widely accepted idea, based on evidence gained by the Portuguese navigator Pedro de Queiroz from islanders he met on his travels. And the lesson is this: if we examine the traditions of indigenous people whose ancestors were closer to the events than we are, we gain a better understanding of what our antediluvian cousins were up to, and how their genius survives as a reminder that civilization is not linear, but an ongoing cyclical experiment. Few have heard of Easter Island's folklore as recorded by its relatively unknown early inhabitants, the Waitaha, who describe Easter Island as an archipelago. This was many thousands of years ago, before the rise in sea level, when, they say, the stars shone in a different sky and a different pattern. Every year, the Waitaha said they welcomed the appearance of the double-hull canoe of the gods, and they called them Urukeu. Now, the Urukeu are described as star walkers and long-distance voyagers who traveled across the Pacific to and from a place called Kainga Nui Nui, which means the enormous land. And then one year, the canoe failed to return when, I quote, "angry stars gathered close to the moon to give birth to the tides of chaos, the dreaded deluge." So this alone places them on Easter Island before 9700 BC, which is the geological date of the Great Flood. The Urukeu survived titanic waves in the Pacific and reached New Zealand. 2 generations after the world turned by water, a female descendant called Hotumatua arrived back on Easter Island with 7 sages. Hotumatua was given charge of mapping the Pacific and its missing lands, many of which had become islands due to rapidly rising sea levels, including her own homeland. And then other descendants of the Urukeu arrived from a continent to the east, where they'd lived for a long period of time. And these Urukeu are described as tall, fair-skinned, red-haired with green eyes, and blonde with blue eyes. And their image is said to be depicted in the oldest moai of Easter Island, whose extended chins portray beards, while the cylinders carved from red scoria and balanced on their heads depict their unusual hair color, at least to people of the Pacific. And even though the Waitaha account is over 11,000 years old, there is no mention of carving the moai. The statues are already an accepted presence on the island, a testament to their extreme antiquity. And this is proved by the location of the quarry, which now lies 80 feet below sea level, submerged by the rising ocean at the end of the Angkor Dryas. After the world turned by water, the grandchildren of the Urukeu set sail from Easter Island to locate the birthplace of the gods, a remote mountain region on New Zealand's South Island. The 3 sacred sites stand in a place of unparalleled beauty. Te Kohanga, also known as the Sacred Nest, was once surrounded by a lake and resembled a primordial island. The second, Kuratauhiti, means distant school. It was the academy of the Urukeu, with each stone said to hold the wisdom of the gods. Among the hundreds of weathered limestone outcrops stand other monoliths, one shaped by human hands by the Keepers of Stone, a group of stonemasons whom the Waitaha described as able to shape stone without breaking its spirit. I recall the first time I saw these monoliths and remarking how many of them don't look natural. They seem to be shaped by human hands, but obviously very weathered. And it was impossible to prove until I read the Waitaha tradition, in which they describe the carving of the stones, particularly that of their tutelary goddess Marotini. And their story goes like this. Huge are the monuments recarved at Te Kohanga. A towering column of the purest stone was shaped to place Marotini in the land. We asked so much of the stone shapers when they carved her to stand against the stars. Tall timbers and thick ropes lifted them high above the land to carve Marotini. Ever higher they climbed to cut away the curving charcoal lines, to reveal the beauty of our ancestor. When might the birthplace of the gods have been established? If the Urukeu were already navigating the Pacific long before the flood, ostensibly they could have been in New Zealand before 10,000 BC. The Waitaha narrative describes a calendar stone somewhere amid the birthplace of the gods. Since ancient temples memorialize the date of their creation by referencing specific stars or constellations, if the calendar stone could be located, it would provide a date reference. This worldwide practice is called archaeoastronomy. I spent a few years hiking the ridges of the birthplace of the gods, but nothing resembling a calendar stone really stood out, so I took my search to a third ridge. As if the views of the valley aren't enough of a distraction, there are also hundreds of limestone outcrops to choose from, and many have clearly been shaped by water, undoubtedly. But as I approached an escarpment, the main sacred site at Kuratauhi came into view in the distance. And at that moment, one monolith stood out from the rest. It didn't look like an active erosion, it looked like a kind of sundial with a protrusion resembling a head and a faint image of eyes, nose and a mouth. But best of all, the only bird in the entire valley was perched on this stone, a falcon of all things. And had I been an ancient Egyptian, I would have said Horus is nodding in agreement. And these coincidences happen all the time when researching ancient mysteries, so I figured this was a good omen and began taking measurements of the sky. So I stood in front of the disk with the head aligned at the top ridge, and I took a compass bearing and altitude. But what was I supposed to be aligning it to? Well, there are two principal constellations in the mythology of the Waitaha, one being the Southern Cross. So, if we roll back the sky to the time of the flood, this constellation only begins to appear above the stone on the spring equinox of 14,800 BC, with the Milky Way, this celestial river, flowing vertically as though pouring out of the stone. The effect must have been magical. And this is correct, then the Urukehu would have had to have been there before the start of the oldest Dryas. But there's another possibility, and that's the second constellation of note, which is Orion, specifically its belt stars. Now, Orion does not rise above the background mountain range for another 4,000 years, until the spring equinox of 10,800 BC, when its belt aligns perfectly with the calendar stone. And the date happens to coincide with a period of meteorite impacts that triggered the Younger Dryas. But to see the entire constellation, one has to wait until the equinox in 10,400 BC. And I got goosebumps when this date popped up because it is commemorated at several prominent monuments around the world, the most well-known being the Pyramids of Giza, which mirror the belt of Orion exactly on the same occasion. Well, it turns out that there are a number of overlapping relationships between the gods of Egypt and the Urukehu. At the same time that Orion appears fully above the calendar stone, across the valley at Kuretauhiti, the goddess Marotini stares at the rising Southern Cross. This dual reference offers a high probability that the Urukehu were commemorating this date at the birthplace of the gods. The Waitaha narrative describes that whenever the Urukehu returned from New Zealand, they would bypass Easter Island due to the behavior of the ocean current, visiting instead the place of ancestors in the Great Land in the east. Whenever they undertook this long voyage, they took two totem birds with them, Titi and Kaka. Together, they give the name to another homeland of the gods, Titicaca, the location of the temple city of Tiwanaku. In order to understand ancient places, it is useful to turn to etymology, particularly the earliest iterations of a name, because it often reveals a true meaning, a purpose, or an event. And in the Altiplano of Bolivia, the oldest languages are Puquina and Aymara. And the syllables Tiwanaku mean my people. Except that the syllable Aku is not Aymara, it is Egyptian, and it means shining being. So Tiwanaku becomes the place of my shining people. We'll return to them in a moment. Tiwanaku is composed of 6 known temples covering 2,000 acres. Its adjacent temple, Pumapunku, is packed with advanced masonry, each stone above and beyond the skill of cavemen, even latter-day stonemasons. But how can we tell if these temples were built before the flood? The focus of excavations by the archaeologist Arthur Poznański was a quadrangle of monolithic standing stones called the Kalasasaya. And he noted how the alignment was off by 18 degrees relative to the sun along the horizon. And this is due to the effects of the Earth's rotation and tilt, which causes the stars to appear in a different part of the sky over the course of millennia. It's a phenomenon called precession. So Poznański recalculated the correlation between the stones and the solstices, and his figures were peer-reviewed by a group of mathematicians and deemed to be correct. This massive quadrangle was built, according to Poznański, in 15,000 BC. But there's something else. Relative to its adjacent temples, the Kalasasaya appears to have been forced to fit a pre-existing plan, because the 3 adjacent sites, the Akapana Mound, the semi-subterranean temple, as well as Pumapunku, are all offset by a further 3 degrees. They reference a very different sky. And given the greater depth of sedimentation, it is likely these 3 sites are even older. It takes the Earth 21,600 years to tilt 3 degrees on its axis. If this correlation is correct, then these 3 sites could be as old as 36,000 BC. And as extreme as this date may sound, there is another link with Egypt here. The Egyptian king list stated in the Turin Papyrus begins around 36,000 BC, a fact that was shared with Greek historians when they visited Egypt over 3,000 years ago. And Poznański himself was also of the opinion that Tiwanaku was built and rebuilt over 3 different stages, with the Akapana, the semi-subterranean temple, and Pumapunku referencing a truly remote era, followed by the Kala Sasaya, and then a rebuilding of the site after it was destroyed by a colossal wall of water that came from the tipping over of Lake Titicaca. The only catastrophe we know that was capable of such destruction was the Great Flood at the end of the Younger Dryas. So who were the gods who built the temple complex of Tiwanaku? And more to the point, who was responsible for its rebuilding? The local Puquina still teach their oral tradition of having fled to the Andes after a flood sank their island continent in the Pacific, and they call it Lupaquije, also known as Mu'ul, or as it became known, Lemuria. And their story says that the temples were rebuilt after the flood by the godman Viracocha, along with his 7 High Waipanti, which means sages, craftspeople, one of whom was both his wife and sister. Now, interestingly, this is a shared observation all around the world, wherever the gods alighted after the flood. High Waipanti translates as Shining Ones, the people for whom Tiwanaku was named. These seafaring gods appeared from the Pacific. They were described as very tall, white-skinned, bearded, red-haired, and were associated with the symbol of the serpent. They were also defined by their elongated skulls. Oh, a treasure trove of skulls was found at Paracas on the coast of Peru, and compared to human skulls, these elongated heads have a 25% larger cranial capacity. And although human skulls are known to have been artificially shaped by parents wishing their children to grow up looking like the gods, artificially shaping a skull cannot increase its cubic capacity. And furthermore, the origin of their DNA leads to the region of the Black Sea, the Middle East, and Egypt. So, might Viracocha and his 7 Shining Ones have been of Egyptian provenance? Edfu, a temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus. Written on its walls are the building texts. They describe how a group of gods called Aku Shemsu Hor began arriving along the Nile after a catastrophe partially sank their homeland, Taneteru, an island somewhere in the region of the Indian Ocean. The event coincides with the incident that caused the Younger Dryas around 10,800 BC. They also had another base, Iutiti, a possible reference to Lake Titicaca and its island of the sun. The Aku Shemsu Hor established a series of sacred mounds along the Nile that became the foundations of future temples. The timing coincides with an anomaly in this region, an agricultural revolution that appeared out of nowhere in the Nile Valley around 10,500 BC. The texts say that within 800 years, a second disaster sank the primeval island of the gods for good, whereupon one group of survivors returned to Egypt. 7 sages led by an 8th, a charismatic leader called Hor. These were the Aku Shemsu Hor, which means shining ones, followers of Horus. Like in other parts of the world, they too are described as between 8.5 to 10 feet tall, light-skinned, with elongated skulls. And just as Viracocha in South America, their stated task was to rebuild the former mansions of the gods. What mansions might they have come to rebuild in Egypt? Oh, I love the building texts. They describe the first appearance of the Shining Ones, the followers of Horus, as the first occasion. And the date is memorialized in the alignment of the pyramids of Giza, the spring equinox of 10,400 BC. But there's at least one site that may be contemporary. The Osirian at Abydos has always been regarded as an underground temple, but it is actually encased in 40 feet of silt, deposited inch by the Nile when the river reached the temple's doorstep, and the regional climate was wetter, the period between 10,500 to 7,000 BC. By 3,500 BC, the Nile had moved over a mile east of Abydos. Pharaohs were still building temples around the Osirian, yet none related to it, as though the building was no longer visible, covered by sand and silt. All that remained was the memory of why the location was important. Then in 1300 BC, Seti I built his own temple, aligned to the same axis as the Osirian, yet his masterpiece stopped short of the underground structure and bends to the left, in total contradiction to temple protocol, leaving its most important room, the Holy of Holies, decapitated from the body. The only reasonable explanation is that the weight of his own temple broke through the ceiling of the now underground structure. Could it be that Seti rediscovered the Osirian and wished to revive its importance? A clue lies in a room built by Seti featuring a revealing panel about the Osirian's namesake, the godman Osiris. Osiris is the hero who is dismembered before he ascends the Milky Way towards the origin of souls, typically the pole star. And he returns resurrected as Horus in the form of a hawk. And Osiris is also the earthly embodiment of Orion. Now, curiously, Seti's own temple does not reference the rising of Orion, nor any other star for that matter, another violation of protocol. It seems to me that this pharaoh wished the Osirian to be the focal point, and yet the Osirian does not reference Orion either, as one would expect for a temple whose presiding god is the earthly embodiment of this constellation. However, Egyptian texts refer to Osiris's consort Isis as the Hawk of Osiris. And on this panel, she is depicted as a kite hawk with outstretched wings, demonstrating her ability to fan the breath of immortality into those she oversaw. For this to occur, the soul of the hero must reside in the region of regeneration, which is the pole star, which is protected by 7 circumpolar stars called the Indestructibles. Now, indestructible is also a metaphor of the regeneration of the soul, as exemplified by the journey taken by Osiris and performed at the Osirian. So, perhaps we should be looking for a hawk in the night sky in connection with this temple. In ancient Egypt, the star Deneb was one of the 7 Indestructibles. Its host constellation is Cygnus. Back in the day, Cygnus was not regarded as a swan, as it is today, but as a hawk. And therein lies the connection with Osiris, the wife who resurrects his soul, and the date when their temple might have been built. If we roll back the sky, Cygnus the hawk finally appears at the entrance of the Osirian in perfect ascent, riding up the Milky Way, the celestial river, towards the location of the souls, with its brightest star Deneb aligning with the axis of the temple. This astonishing event took place on the winter solstice and spring equinox of 10,500 BC. We now have the Shining Ones present before and after the flood in both Egypt and the Andes. Both groups are described as master seafarers and astronomers. Both sites feature shared megalithic construction methods, even anomalies. And in turn, Viracocha and his 7 Shining Ones resemble the Urukeu gods of New Zealand and Easter Island, the same red-haired seafaring astronomers who employed identical building methods throughout the Pacific. As for the Urukeu, they may be the same followers of Horus, because both their leaders were navigators and astronomers, and both held the title Net of the World for their ability to map the rearranged lands after the flood. And they are depicted as such in the Temple of Edfu. And furthermore, All the above were associated with Orion. There are too many overlapping criteria linking the flood gods in different corners of the world, making it highly probable that they are one and the same group of people. Could they also have been present in the Mediterranean? 11,000 years ago, a stonemason living between Tunisia and Sicily cut a 39-foot monolith, drilled parallel holes, transported it a quarter of a mile and placed it upright. Now it lies 130 feet below the Mediterranean Sea. The attached shells are dated to 9,300 BC, meaning that the menhir was placed on dry land before the catastrophic rise in sea level after the flood. The rising Mediterranean radically affected nearby Malta, cutting it off from Sicily and turning it into an island. And Malta is home to miles of parallel grooves resembling cart ruts, except that some show signs of having been artificially carved rather than created by repetitive use of wheels. On the south side of the island, they reach the edge of the cliff, they drop 600 feet, continue under the Mediterranean, then reappear on the summit of an island 3 miles away. The land bridge that once connected the two islands collapsed when great pressure was placed upon it. Now, if early Roman historians are correct, this pressure was the result of titanic waves traveling from the west, from the direction of the Atlantic, before smashing into Malta. Perhaps. What is certain is that by 7,600 BC, the grooves were submerged. Could the same tidal waves have been responsible for dumping 7,000 people, animals, and utensils into the hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, including hundreds of long-haired people? By this point, I had developed a theory based on accumulated evidence that the flood gods lived in seclusion on islands, including Tiwanaku, which was designed like an artificial island on Lake Titicaca. And only through necessity, brought about by severe climatic changes, were they forced to move to continental areas and interact with ordinary people. Now, this hypothesis fits in well with the hundreds of flood stories which mention the surviving gods arriving by boat from their drowned lands. Was Malta home to such a reclusive society? The archipelago features a disproportionate concentration of temples resembling no other, as though belonging to an isolated culture. Temples like Gantija, the Tower of the Giantess. Gantija appears out of nowhere, fully developed, without precedent, without a trial and error stage. Its older stones are megalithic, but on top we find inferior stones, sloppy of construction, as though rehabbed after a major conflagration. The thing is, all Maltese temples demonstrate the kind of erosion only made possible by prolonged exposure to wet weather, which in this region occurred in the epoch of 10,000 to 8,000 BC. Now, Malta shares the same climatic footprint as the Giza Plateau, and the temples adjacent to the pyramids show exactly the same pattern of erosion by enormous volumes of water. Might the Maltese temples share the same era as the underwater monolith? To test this idea, let's look at the archaeoastronomy of Gantija. The temple features two misaligned axes, as though tracking two related yet separate objects simultaneously. The view of the horizon is of a hill that has been deliberately flattened, as though serving some astronomical function. As the sky rolls backwards through time, no alignments are obvious until the era of 12,000 BC, when, on the spring equinox, the first axis marks the positions of major lunar standstill, while the second axis marks the sunrise. Another place where unusual parallel grooves are found is the Azores, and they too run to the edge of cliffs and into the ocean. Now, the Azores archipelago is, of course, the favorite candidate for Atlantis, and even discounting a major subsidence in the mid-Atlantic ridge due to damage from meteorite impacts and rising sea levels, the Azores were still a formidable island chain 11,000 years ago. And if you take the bathymetric maps of the region, they even bear a resemblance to the continents once described and depicted on ancient maps. It is said Atlantis sank in 3 stages, each following a natural catastrophe, which sounds uncannily like a description of the 3 catastrophes that generated each of the Dryas events. If so, we should find evidence of dry land along the mid-Atlantic ridge from before the first event. At the beginning we asked, could a landmass sink in the blink of a geological eye? As history shows all too often, yes it can. But an island the size of a continent? Well, a local dredging operation in the Azores in the 1970s recovered rocks at a depth of 6,000 feet, showing signs of exposure to oxygen, while sediment taken from the mid-Atlantic ridge revealed the remains of freshwater plants and beach sand created along an ancient shoreline, indicating the Azores were still above sea level in 15,000 BC. So, now the question is, what happened to its civilization? Well, a funny thing happened when I landed in the Azores on the way to Lisbon. A headline in the morning newspaper said, "Silver discovers underwater pyramid." It's amazing how much work one can do while sleeping on an airplane. Well, it turns out it wasn't me, it was another local man by the same name who discovered a 180-foot tall step pyramid, perfectly aligned to the compass points, as most pyramids tend to be, and 120 feet below sea level. The Portuguese Navy investigated the claim and said Silver was mistaken. His sonar images captured nothing more than a seamount, perfectly aligned to grid north and in the shape of a step pyramid. It's astonishing what nature and erosion can do. And later it transpires that the Navy did not follow Silver's GPS coordinates, but searched the wrong area, to which they replied Silver had the wrong coordinates because his equipment was faulty. Now, isn't it amazing how for 20 years this fisherman managed to sail in the middle of a volatile ocean, out of sight of land, yet managed to return safely home each time? You'd think that the debunkers would learn to make up better stories. Who might the Atlantean gods have been? The first landmass to the east of the Azores is Portugal. The oldest myths of the region describe a great inundation and the sinking of a great island, from which emerged a group of unusual people called Ophusa, the people of the serpent. Meanwhile, to the west, several groups of wise people arrived in boats on the coast of Yucatan. The local tradition states they migrated from stepping stone to stepping stone from the east. In other words, they hopped from island to island, all that remained of their drowned homeland called Atl. The sacred book Chilam Balam puts the date of their arrival at 9600 BC, the same date given by the Egyptians for the sinking of Atlantis. The collective name of these gods was the Its, meaning sorcerer, magician, and their title of sacred office was the Kanul, which means the people of the serpent. And it has nothing to do with snakes. The symbolism implies people who understood and controlled the forces of electromagnetism, what science calls telluric forces or telluric currents. And they refer to the land where they disembarked, Yucatan, as Mayab, the land of the few, in recognition of the survivors of the flood. And in time, their progeny would be called Maya, which means water. Now, the Its are described by the Maya teachers as architects of the sky who spoke Hersuyethau, the language of light. Paints quite a picture, doesn't it? And they said to have arrived in 3 groups of 7, each led by an 8th, a charismatic leader, one of whom was called Itzamna. He was tall, light-skinned with Caucasian features and a long beard, as were the other 2 leaders, Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl. The Its moved across Yucatan, establishing temple cities like Chichen Itza, which bears their name, and Tikal and Uxmal, whose temples reflect the architecture of the cosmos. These were astral academies, each building encoded with their knowledge of mathematics, science and astronomy, information brought from a submerged homeland and hardwired into huge monuments to ensure its survival in future cataclysms. In time, the buildings expanded into the temples we see today. The Itz continued inland and into the mountains of Guatemala, understandably far from the ocean. Eventually they settled on a lake called Atitlan, named for their sunken island home, where they built a city called Utatlan as a replica of the one they'd lost. Their other main center of activity was on Lake Petén Itzá on the island Noche Petén, and it means Great Island, although a much larger island exists nearby. Now, what made this island great was that it was their main spiritual center, a scaled-down version of their lost atoll, or Atitlan, featuring 21 temples and a step pyramid. There's no trace of any temple on Noche Petén today, all destroyed by the Spanish, who used the temples as a quarry for their own houses. And even the name was changed to Flores. But why not use the bigger island next door, I wondered? Well, perhaps the smaller island's strategic view of the horizon down the neck of the lake had something to do with their decision. So I decided to find out. I reasoned that the Great Pyramid must have stood where the main church does today, a standard Catholic practice back in the day. But how do you find out? Well, first, the standard practice for the church was to align its buildings east to west to commemorate Christ's death around the equinox. Now, when they don't follow this protocol, it is proven again and again that an original temple lies beneath. And in this case, the Church of Flores is not aligned due east, but towards the southeast, clearly superimposed upon something much older. Secondly, when I asked the priest to see the stones of the pyramid, which formed the foundation of the building, he booted me out in no uncertain terms out of the church. That's a sure sign you're close to the honeypot. Now, the rest was purely academic. From the church's vantage point, you get an unobstructed view of the horizon down the neck of the lake. And in 7600 BC, the winter solstice would have been aligned to the 9-tier pyramid that once stood on this location. According to the Maya, Central American temple tradition is the continuation of Atitlan, the rebuilding of the former world of the gods. One clue lies in the Maya serpent dynasty, which covers 16,000 years, and most likely originated in Atitlan before continuing in Yucatan after the flood. Another is the age of the original temples. They are built like layers of an onion, growing organically and adapting to the changes in the movements of the planets and stars they track. A recent excavation on the corner of the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza reveals an older layer, which traditions claim was originally built by a serpent priest. Is the Maya dynasty so old? 358 cave systems were recently found near the Temple of Tulum, a submerged world filled with the remains of enormous sloths, proto-elephants, extinct fauna, and Maya artifacts and skeletons, all trapped by rising seas by 8000 BC. Validation that the Maya were already established in the Yucatan in remote times and witnessed the arrival of the Itz from their sunken homeland. And yet the people of the serpent were present on the other side of the world too. It's a strange coincidence that Itzamna is a compound name of Izanami and Izanagi, who were the builders of civilization after the flood in Japan around 8000 BC. And here they are known as Nagi, the people of the serpent. Two such flood heroes, Nuhua and Fu He, founded the Chinese dragon bloodline. And this same dynasty encompasses Indochina, Polynesia, and particularly Fiji and India, where they are called Naga, the serpent people. No matter where you travel in this part of the world, traditions describe heroes emerging from a flood, accompanied by 7 rishi, sages who instructed humans on civilization, built megalithic structures, and to all intent and purpose behaved like magicians. always very tall, light-skinned, with blonde or red hair, and long beards. The region where all of these stories, people, names and attributes converge is Upper Mesopotamia, where we find another kind of missing land, the lost hill of Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe was rediscovered in the 1990s. It is an artificial mountain containing at least 50 elliptical enclosures featuring standing stones as tall as 19 feet. The average carbon-14 dating of the site is 9,984 BC, placing much of it before the flood. However, the samples were taken from the walls which obscure important carvings on the pillars. Therefore, they were not integral to the site. The walls were added later, after the temple ceased to function. To get a sense of when it might have been built, we turn again to the stars. Enclosure D is the most studied, perhaps because its pillars are the most decorated. It has been suggested that its alignment is to the northern setting of Cygnus, but there's a small problem with this theory. This enclosure sits 30 feet below the summit, which obscures one's line of vision. And secondly, the ancients rarely, if ever, celebrated the descent of a celestial object. Only its rising or mid-heaven elevation was celebrated. So perhaps a re-evaluation is in order. If we take the era of the earliest carbon-14 dating, which is 10,290 BC, a number of things begin to emerge. In the northern sky at this time, Vega was still considered the pole star. A view from enclosure D on the winter solstice of 10,400 BC would have seen Vega in elliptical rotation around the celestial pole. And its movement is framed by the two central pillars. Now, Vega's appearance after sunset is actually marked by pillar 43, the one carved with vultures moving around the circle. Vega's name derives from Waki, meaning falling or swooping, referring to a time when the movement of its host constellation, Lyra, resembled a swooping vulture. So the pillar accurately depicts the behavior of this star around the celestial pole. But we're missing the best part. Enclosure D's clear line of vision is to the southeast. Now, with Vega visible to the north, to the south, the belt of Orion rises briefly above the horizon on the winter solstice. Its narrow arc framed by pillars 19 and 33, with pillar 32 marking its highest ascension in the era of 10,400 BC. So this reference to Orion in 10,400 BC raises very important issues, specifically with regard to Giza, where the same relationship takes place on the same date. This is where the understanding of place names comes in very useful. The original name of Göbekli Tepe is Portasar, an Armenian word that breaks into two syllables. Port is an umbilical cord or navel, and Asar is the original name of Osiris. Therefore, the hill is the umbilical cord of Osiris. As we said earlier, Osiris is the earthly embodiment of Orion, and his dwelling place is Giza. So we have a name association and a date connecting two locations. But what could this umbilical cord be referring to? Well, if you take a line from the corner of the pyramid attributed to Menkaure and draw it through the corner of the one attributed to Khufu, you arrive at Portasar, the second dwelling place of Osiris. So the name is giving us a geodetic clue suggesting that the two sites are linked. Now, what does this tell us about the architects of Portasar? The hill's deliberate southeastern exposure offers a sightline to an ancient astronomical tower in the town of Haran. There has been human activity here since at least 8000 BC. Back then, it was called Har Anu, which translates roughly as the enclosure of Anu, But who was Anu? In Mesopotamian tradition, a scribe by the name Emed-ur-Anu wrote down his encounters with people of his lineage, the lords of Anu. The accounts took place hundreds of years before the flood. These antediluvian gods were known as Anunnaki, the people of Anu. In India, they were also known as Anu-Nagi, the people of the serpent.
The scribe's name was later changed by the Hebrews to Enoch. He describes the Anunnaki as having unusually white skin, which seems to have been sensitive to sunlight, because they're often applying oil to it, giving their skin a shining appearance, hence the nickname, Shining Ones. But the nickname also defined their status as enlightened people. So essentially, the Anunnaki are the same gods as Viracocha and his Shining Ones in the Andes, the same as the Canul of Central America, the Ophiuza of Portugal, the Urukeu of Easter Island and New Zealand, and of course the Egyptian Shining Ones, the followers of Horus. And this incredible string of dots continues with the gods who assisted the Hopi escape their sinking land in the Pacific during the flood. And they call them the Red Ant People. And the phrase comes from the two Hopi words for ant and reddish sand, Anu and Naki. We are looking at one international group of sages, human-like and yet not entirely human, whose seafaring skills enable them to move from home to home across the oceans as easily as you and I go to the supermarket.
Which may explain why there is so much Egyptian vocabulary throughout Polynesia. For example, an island in Fiji called Ra-Yatea, the white-skinned people of Ra. In the Solomon Islands, there is Izatabu, the restricted sacred abode of Isis. And of course, why there exist identical megalithic building techniques stretching like an umbilical cord from Egypt through the Central Pacific and all the way to the Andes.
But what of the lords of Anu? Well, these gods oversaw 7 groups of 7 lords. They were referred to as Apkallu, sages, and their nickname was Watchers. Now, the Watchers were demonized in biblical texts purely for political reasons, but in the original story, they are largely seen as helpers of humanity, a fact acknowledged by Native American cultures who called them lookers, messengers who were instrumental in helping the Hopi escape their sunken Pacific islands after the Great Flood, back in the days when they were called Hisat Sinom, or as we know them, Anasazi.
Throughout Mesopotamia, the Watchers were depicted by figurines called mezare, which were placed at the corners of sacred buildings to ward off evil spirits. The name means Watchers and Awakened Ones, a metaphor indicating their qualities as guardians as well as enlightened people.
It stands to reason that if the Watchers were even being used as talismans to protect buildings from harm, they would hardly have been evil people, as the Bible would have us believe. The lords of Anu and the Watchers were distinguishable from humans insofar as they possessed knowledge of the mechanics of nature and how to manipulate it. Thus they were compared to gods. And this was also the view of the Egyptians, who referred to them both as Urshu, which means watchers, and Neter, a force of nature, a god. And in addition to their shining skin, they were also very tall.
Mesopotamian tradition hints that the flood gods lived in 7 secluded locations. So far in this program, we have identified Atitlan, Lapukige, also known as Mul and Lemuria, Kainganunui in the Pacific, the birthplace of the gods in New Zealand, and Titicaca. The assembly of the lords of Anu itself is said to have been on a high mountain called Ardis, speculated to have existed in the region between the Black and Caspian Seas.
The lords of Anu, these people of the serpent, they were said to live in a compound called Garsag, but it's never been properly located. That is until I met the last wisdom keeper from a hard-to-find island in the Pacific called Tongareva, one of the Cook Islands. And he shared with me his people's tradition that a group of gods arrived from the Middle East around 3000 BC. They were said to be great sages, star navigators, and intelligent people. Red-haired, fair-skinned, shining people who belonged to a very ancient lineage of wisdom keepers called Tuanaki, better known to us as Anunnaki. Now, the wisdom keeper also told me this group were present throughout the Pacific far earlier, around the time of the global flood, specifically on Easter Island, and one sacred platform there still carries their name, Ahu Hanunaku. Interestingly, Ahu is a variant of the Egyptian Aku, as in Aku Shemsuhor, the shining ones, the followers of Horus. But Tongarevan tradition further states that the original homeland of the Lords of Anu was an island nation in the Indian Ocean by the name Te Pitaka. It is described as a secluded circular island which sank during a great cataclysm 11,000 years ago. And the region around it was totally transformed to the point where the island is no longer visible, because when parts of the Indian Ocean sank, others rose. So this missing land of the gods existed in the general region where today stands the Arabian Peninsula. Interestingly, this is the same general location of the homeland of the gods alluded to by the Egyptians, an island of fire. So somewhere in this region is another missing homeland of the Shining Ones, the people of the Serpent, Anunnaki, Watchers, Viracochas, and so on.
Two pieces of circumstantial evidence point to these flood gods, these master seafarers and astronomers who once lived on this island, who set out to hand humanity the art of civilization after the world was turned upside down 11,000 years ago. The first is a monument in Abu Dhabi. It is totally out of character for the region, but a visitor from the Andes would look at its style of construction and believe they were still back home, or Egypt or Easter Island for that matter. The other piece of evidence is Papyrus 1115.
Papyrus 1115 describes the voyage of a sailor down the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. And the ship is caught in a storm, all hands perish, except the narrator, of course, who is shipwrecked on what he believes to be a deserted island. Now eventually he meets the leader of the island, who gives him food and a boat and returns him home to Egypt. Now, it is not known when this account took place. It is extremely old, thousands of years old. However, as he embarks, the leader tells the sailor this will be the last time he'll see the island, because soon it will vanish, consumed by a rising of the ocean. The sailor then offers a description of the unusual person who ruled this island, a serpent with deep blue eyes and a beard. It seems this ancient mariner is giving us a glimpse of one of the many flood gods who went by the title People of the Serpent, not to mention one of the missing lands where these helpers of humanity once held a great and memorable civilization before teaching us how to create our own. Now, the idea that we suddenly discovered the accoutrements of civilization around 8000 BC doesn't seem so far-fetched.